Good afternoon and welcome to our virtual event on the Great Awokening. I'm Raihan Salam, the president of the Manhattan Institute, and I'm excited to be moderating today's discussion with three highly original thinkers. We're joined by Musa Al-Gharbi, a Paul F. Lazarsfeld Fellow in Sociology at Columbia University, Zach Goldberg, a PhD candidate in political science at Georgia State University, and Eric Kaufmann, professor of politics at Birkbeck College, University of London, and author of the excellent 2019 book, Whiteshift, Populism, Immigration, and the Future of White Majorities. Throughout the conversation, please feel free to submit your questions on whatever platform you're watching us from, and we will save some time at the end and do our best to get to as many of them as we can. I will now ask our panelists to help set the stage and provide some context for us today. First, Zach, you in some way have prompted this conversation on the Great Awokening. You've written that it can be understood as the sharp leftward movement of white liberals on cultural issues like race, immigration, and diversity. And you see 2014 as a kind of crucial moment when this trend began to gain serious momentum. Can you tell us a bit about the Great Awokening as you understand it?
Yeah, well, let me first just preface this, but I mean, I guess I discovered the Great Awokening by first trying to, I guess, jump on the bandwagon after the 2016 election of, what's motivating these Trump voters. There must be something unique about them. And then, I was comparing Trump to Romney voters, and I saw, there aren't that really distinguishable differences between them. I mean, maybe on immigration, but when you look at the left or those that voted for Hillary compared to those that voted for Obama in 2012, it was night and day, especially on racial attitudes. And I was wondering, okay, there's a difference between 2012 and 2016. How deep does this rabbit hole go? So I started looking at other data. Other data being, I guess in total, I compiled 69 different time series of racial attitudes over the past few years, and that has culminated in a singular index of attitudes on race, I guess more specifically about perceptions of discrimination, attributions of discrimination, support for affirmative action, for instance, and what you find is that at least in the aggregate, when you combine all these different attitudes together, you find that in 2014, you see things start to trend upwards really reaching, I guess, record heights in terms of racial liberalism, which is the measure that I created. 2014 was a year, as some of you in the audience might be aware, it was the year where Black Lives Matter really got going. You had the Ferguson unrest, you had the Michael Brown shooting, you had the Tamir Rice case, you had a number of different incidents in that year. And at the same time, coincidentally, during that same year, you actually had the crescendoing of social media. I mean, in terms of the social media adoption, 2014 was the year that really Twitter users, it reached an apex, I guess. In a span of, I guess, just a few years between 2008, 2014, the number of Twitter users like quadrupled. So you have a lot of people on Twitter. You have and I think really the awakening in 2014 you see is it a confluence of really technological developments along with political developments and exogenous shocks, like you have these incidents. I think I could speak to, there's a number of different dimensions I could speak to. Right now I'm speaking to the technological component of it. I do think the digital media environment has really, I guess, changed the way that, or at least the awareness that particularly white Americans or white liberal Americans have about race and racial inequality. I think, especially with the advent of camera phones, in the rise of digital, or I guess independent journalism, this has really I guess increased the exposure at which white liberals and Democrats have, towards incidents like incidents of discrimination, barbecue Becky's, police shooting videos. It's not that I think liberals, like the dispositions of liberals have changed. It's that their dispositions were waiting for this moment, this technological moment, where their dispositions could really interact with all this stimuli in the new digital media environment. And I think that liberals have certain predispositions that make them very susceptible to, when they see, acts of injustice, they can be very, very morally, triggered by them. And I think what you see, what you see in the data is that more than at any time, at least since the 1960s, liberals perceive there to be a high deal of discrimination against blacks. They're now more likely to attribute black disadvantage to racism and discrimination. They're now more likely than ever to support affirmative action, preferential government assistance for blacks, and this has really all transpired in the past few years. Am I able to show a graph to just provide? There we go. So here is that measure that I was referring to, which really aggregates 69 different time series of racial attitudes. And what you can see is that, and I think Eric, noticed this, that, there were a couple different waves in the awakening. And the past few years has been the largest wave. But as you could see here, the blue line here, or the dark blue line, this denotes white Democrats. And as you could see from the 1970, there was more or less stability into 1980, and then you see a rise in the mid or late 80s, and then things are kind of stable, more or less, for the next few decades, till you reach about, you could see here, things start to trend upward during the second Obama term in office. And this is when you see this really, unprecedented swing upward to the point that white Democrats are about 3 standard deviations above their average. In terms of their racial liberalism, or I guess you could call it their wokeness, they're now 3 standard deviations above where they've been, on average across time. So this is quite a leap. And I find that, in addition to the rise of digital media, you also have a lot of news outlets that went digital during this time period. And you could see, I have another slide, further down below, where you find that more and more, the number of liberals and Democrats, white Democrats and liberals that receiving their news from the New York Times and the Washington Post doubled between, the increase began in 2012 and some data sets, but you could see that there's been a lot of, a lot of liberals are picking up the New York Times now, and the New York Times itself is starting to circulate a lot of, woke jargon. As you could see here in this graph, I kind of created an index of New York Times usage of woke jargon, and just very briefly, it's a scale that pretty much consists of a number of terms, the frequencies of which a number of terms are used or appear in the New York Times. So this green line here is what that is representing. And as you could see here, there is really an almost perfect correlation of almost like, it's 0.95, the max correlation is 1. So there is a very, very strong correlation between the shifts in woke terminology in the New York Times and the shifts in white Democrat racial liberalism. Now one could say, okay, this is maybe just spurious. I ran some subsequent analysis, and what you find is that not only does the shifts in white Democrat public or racial opinion follow shifts in woke terminology in the New York Times and in other media outlets, but net of even variables like generational replacement. I mean, that's one of the variables which people attribute to more, I guess, moderate or liberal racial attitudes, is that just generations are replaced, and that's why we're seeing this. I show that even when you control for general racial replacement, and you also control for economic sentiment and other exogenous variables, that the New York Times woke index is the strongest predictor of movement in white Democrat racial attitudes. Now, I don't want to attribute it all to the New York Times. I don't think it's really just the New York Times that's driving everything, but I do think that the media environment, I mean, what's the patterns you see in the New York Times are, I guess, reflect a broader shift in how the media talks about and frames discussions of race. Now, there's a question of, well, what shifted the New York Times and all these media outlets? And that's a question that's, I guess, open to speculation. I think, and this is from having studied, done the same analysis very recently on Twitter activity, what I find is that with the rise of social media like Twitter and the increasing digital presence that these media outlets have on Twitter, what you find is that they feed off of each other. So you have really social media was a boon for the activists or the, I guess, progressive ideologues that previously were probably confined to obscure blogs that nobody read. Now they have a voice and reach, access to a much wider audience. And they have videos.
Zach, we're going to have more opportunity to discuss all of this. So just briefly, just a couple of just quick clarifying points. So tell me if I'm understanding this right. Yeah. One part of the story is that while white non-liberals, their opinion did not change markedly, what you've seen is a sharp shift in opinion among white liberals. That's part of the story.
No, I mean, I wouldn't completely characterize it as that. I mean, you do see shifts in the opinions of non-white Democrats and non-white liberals.
In terms of magnitude.
Yeah. The pace at which the attitudes of white Democrats and liberals have changed, if you could go back to the slide, I'll show you, because this kind of answers your question. In 2014,
just briefly get a sense that basically you've seen a very big magnitude when it comes to the attitude shift among white liberals. And when it comes to, and tell me about the contrast between white liberals and non-white liberals. Has there been any divergence there?
Yeah, if you go to the next slide that I had there, you see that white liberals now surpass non-white liberals in terms of their racial liberalism.
Got it. So something in particular has affected that particular slice of the population. Now I want to bring in Eric Kaufmann. Eric, you have been a scholar of cultural and identity and comparative context for a very long time. And so one thing you've observed is that this cultural normative shift that Zach has described since 2014, this is not the first instance we've seen something like this. So tell us more about that.
Yeah, so I very much try and trace this back to the history of ideas and the evolution, because really what I think we're witnessing is not Marxism. What it is it's a hybrid ideology, something completely new that builds elements of liberalism as well as elements of a cultural form of Marxism, and it blends those two things together into a very powerful ideology. Actually, if you look at the history of American liberalism, you can see that the liberal progressive movement in the early 20th century was talking about ethnicity and subsequently about pluralism before socialists and communists got there. And then you then had a period where modernists, a kind of counterculture that rejected the Anglo-Protestant tradition, which was bound up, of course, with the prohibition of alcohol, but also with restriction of immigration. That was rejected by these bohemian kind of modernists who were more liberal in a way. And then on that foundation, which sort of bleeds into the Beat movement, for example, and then into the hippies in the 60s, on that foundation, you then get Marcuse and critical theory and the kind of cultural transposition of Marxism from, instead of talking about the proletariat versus the bourgeoisie, it's now white males, and then it's people of color and so on. I also want to make the point that So what you had is this ideology which then bursts onto the scene in the late 1960s. And it's a bit like American Protestantism, which has had its great awakenings, first of all in the 1700s, the early 1700s, and then in the early 1800s, and you could argue even in the early 20th century, is that once you have this ideology established, you can get periodic waves of enthusiasm that are driven by an avant-garde, and dynamics occasionally will sort of be self-perpetuating, and you'll get these waves, these awakenings. Hence the term Great Awokening, which is a sort of transposition of the Great Awakening terminology to this political religion, which if we can go to the slides, I want to show you this a bit in the data. If we look at Google search results in Google Trends, and this other studies have found this, that basically searches for both for racism and for sexism are highly linked to a progressive orientation, and we can see here there's a correlation between search frequencies for racism and for sexism, and the states that come out strongest on both of these index tend to be places like Vermont and Rhode Island, and they tend not to be places like Virginia, Utah, and Texas. That's sort of just telling you really that these searches are correlated with something substantive. If we go to the next slide, you can see the next slide, please. I'll just let them know. Okay, sorry. Right. So this next slide really is simply showing the Democratic share amongst voters in a state and the Google searches for the term racist in May-June 2020. District of Columbia scoring very high for both Democratic, is a very Democratic area, and also a very strong number of searches for racism. And again, you have these same sort of coastal states over here scoring highly for searches for racism, whereas the places that are less Democratic, have a stronger Republican cast. You have fewer of these searches. So that's kind of setting the scene for the importance of these terms, racist and sexist. Now, I want to look at the historical trajectory of the use of the term racism, starting in 1960 and moving to 2019 in Google Ngram Viewer. And these are American English language books. And what you see is there's an initial takeoff in usage of the term racism in the late 1960s. This would be what I would call the first Great Awakening. There is then, with the rise of the term political correctness and Bloom's closing of the American mind, that first wave of speech codes and Afrocentrism and all of that, which I lived through and remember very well, that is the second Great Awakening. And what we are actually into post-2014 is the third Great Awakening. So what I would say here is we can't forget about the late 60s and late 80s, early 90s awakenings, which, by the way, were also accompanied by student protests, by antics. I mean, in the late 60s, universities were taken over. Black Panthers occupied with weaponry student offices. There were demands for, 50 black studies professors. Every black student must be admitted. Stuff that is arguably crazier than what we see now was occurring. And we tend to forget these earlier waves. The point here is that each wave consolidated, partly through a march entryism into institutions like universities, consolidated power and gradually increased the social power. And again, we can see the same pattern with the term sexism, the takeoff in the late 60s, second Great Awakening in the early 90s, and then the third Great Awakening. And if you look at the magnitude of these shifts, the current Great Awakening is not more important than these previous Great Awakenings. So I would say we are in this surging ideology that is built successively upon gains in the past and goes through occasional spasms, one of which we're in right now. So that's just to sort of set the scene a little bit in terms of the patterns we see, and to put a bit of a historical perspective on this. I think the driver is not what Jonathan Haidt might, he looks at child rearing practices, kids not being allowed to ride their bicycles. My view on that is that's not particularly important. What's more important is the fact that you have, like with American Protestant Christianity, you have a base of religious belief, and then from that you get these occasional spasms where avant-gardes try and take it to the next level. and which is what we're in right now. The problem, in my view, that we need to address is that underlying religion. And I think, again, the elements haven't changed much since the 60s. It's focused primarily on race, gender, sexuality. Those are the three totemic categories. Those are still the totemic categories. Yes, trans is kind of a slightly new innovation, but it fits pretty well with that biopolitic, what Foucault would call biopolitics. It's not class. It's very clearly to do with race and gender, and it's very much religious, so that you cannot have enough. So you can't be too diverse. Too diverse. Diversity is a sacred value. You have to maximize it. You can never say, isn't there a trade-off between solidarity and diversity? That is essentially breaking a taboo. That's sacrilege. So this is one of the reasons why there's a free speech problem, is because whenever you do anything that breaks a taboo around race, gender, and sexuality, which are central to the religion, then we get a problem. And incidentally, I would say it's not just things happening on campus. The significance of these awakenings is that they help create an atmosphere of polarization, because they take over institutions, implement these taboos, which then shuts down debate. So, for example, if you take immigration, because immigration can be associated with race and racism, that then made it impossible really to campaign on reducing immigration, not only in the United States, but in Europe as well. For example, in Sweden, the Swedish, one of the mainstream parties wanted to have a debate over immigration levels. They were accused of racism in the media. So the only people that could have that discussion were the Sweden Democrats, the populist right. And similarly in the US, Trump was the only one of those 17 primary candidates willing to violate this taboo, which had been gradually erected by these previous Great Awakenings. And so they aren't just about on-campus antics or free speech problems. They actually have measurable downstream impacts, one of which is populism, right-wing populism, which I think comes very much from the fact that some of these key issues, notably on immigration, couldn't be discussed. Pressure built up, and the only people who could address that were populists. So that's kind of just a little bit of kind of background to this discussion. I mean, I think we'll let Musa come in here, and I'm sure he's got plenty to tell us.
Thanks very much, Eric.
Sure.
Musa Al-Gharbi, my sense is that you see this less, the emergence of wokeness, this new sensibility around racial justice, you see this less as an ideological phenomenon, less as a question of left or right, and more as a phenomenon that tells us something about elites and elite institutions. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, and I'll say just briefly, I wrote two essays, one called Seizing the Means of Knowledge Production and another called Potholes on the Road to Institutional Reform, that look at the first two previous Great Awakenings and how they were institutionalized and sort of contribute to the present moment. So I just want to second Eric's point that we've been through moments like this before. But I do tend to avoid looking at this as an ideological thing associated with specifically with the left, in part because we see some of the same shifts happening actually among people on the right, but specifically with white elites. So briefly, for instance, a lot of the people who are championing various shades of wokeness today aren't leftists in the traditional sense. So business schools tend to be super woke. There's a great essay on this in New Republic called The Bankrupt Ideology of Business Schools. Some of the main clients of Robin DiAngelo and others peddling similar nostrums right now are corporations who are trying to show that they're with it on race. Woke capitalism is big business right now. Companies in a range of fields are going out of their way to signal their allegiance to Black Lives Matter or LGBTQ causes, and in general, you see. So elites are more likely to be socially liberal, and they're also more likely to be white, and so that's part of why I think you see this especially pronounced among whites who are liberal, is just because those are people who are usually elites. But I think the elites is the important thing. You do see similar trends among some elites of color. So not people of color writ large, but among elites of color. And there are a bunch of reasons, I think, why that I've talked about in some of my work about why elites have increasingly been about the functions that this kind of discourse serves for elites. But one thing I'll flag is, so usually what's interesting is we do see great polarization between, for instance, Democrats and Republicans on a lot of these issues related to race. And usually when we think about polarization, we think about two parties moving in opposite directions. But that's not what's happening here. What we see, and I first pointed this out in an essay called Race and the Race for the White House on Social Research in the Age of Trump. This gentleman was trying to argue that racism motivated Trump voters more than other factors. But when you looked at his data, including at his graph, what you see actually is that Republicans became less likely to endorse racist attitudes in 2016 than they were in 2012. That is, Trump voters were less racist than Romney voters. But the gap between Democrats and Republicans is bigger than it had ever been. And the reason it was bigger than it had ever been is because you saw this crazy shift with Democrats, larger than any other shift on record around going back to the 80s. And not only did he find that Republicans were less likely to endorse racist views, even though he interpreted it the opposite way, he also found Trump voters were less authoritarian than Romney voters. And this isn't an outlier. For instance, Diana Mutz had this much publicized study arguing that Trump voters were motivated by status threat. When you recontextualize her data, as I did, it turns out actually immigration was on balance a losing issue for Trump. It made people less likely to vote for him than they were otherwise inclined to be. And her own data shows that Trump voters were warmer on immigration on average than Romney voters were. In the 2016 election, people making $200,000 or more shifted to Democrats in a way that was without historical precedent. White educated voters similarly shifted heavily towards Democrats. And since the election, there continues to be movement in that same direction, especially among upper socioeconomic status and highly educated white Republicans. Almost all the attrition that Trump has seen since 2016 has come from this group. Trump and the Republicans held their margins with African Americans and Hispanics, for instance, in the 2018 midterms, and continue to hold similar margins in contemporary polling. The shifts that you've seen is all from pretty wealthy, highly educated whites that are fleeing the Republican Party. And they've done some sophisticated analyses by the New York Times and others that showed that this movement doesn't seem to be driven by the COVID response or something like this. It's driven heavily by Trump's response to the George Floyd protests and his sort of rhetoric in the aftermath. The last thing I'll flag on this point is I'm doing a project with this communications scholar, David Rosado, and what we find is that the bias in left-leaning and right-leaning media is actually roughly the same. It's the same. The difference between right and left-leaning media isn't that one group tends to say favor blacks over whites and the other favors whites over blacks. In principle, when you're speaking in general terms, both left and right media tend to have come to favor minorities over whites in their discourse. The difference, at least in the abstract, when you use concrete names, it's different. And it's different for both. But the difference is just the magnitude of the bias. The magnitude, so left-leaning outlets favor minorities in a much stronger way than right-leaning outlets, but they both favor minorities on average, and same with women, et cetera. And when you look at the long-term trends, left and right-leaning media actually trend in very similar ways. So these shifts that you're seeing are, to my mind, less about the left specifically. The trends are most pronounced among Democrats. but they're not restricted to Democrats. You're seeing similar shifting for white elites across the board, including white Republican elites. And actually, it's driving many former white Republican elites to move to associate themselves instead with the Democratic Party and to vote with Democratic candidates.
This is a question for anyone who'd like to take it, but I wonder, so when you're thinking about the woke sensibility, when you think about this deep concern with anti-racism, this kind of left modernist sensibility, a lot of it is centered on the idea of the excluded, the marginalized, a victim class of people who are outgroups. What do we know about public opinion within those minority groups and how that's changed over time? Because if Zach is right, you see this very sharp change among not just white liberals, but college-educated elite white liberals. Musa, you're saying that this is something you see really across political lines as well. So if that's the case, have you seen any interesting patterns within minority populations?
Yeah, I mean, I'll speak to that just because of what I've seen on this, and I'm kind of intending to publish something on it. But the picture, say, if you take African Americans, is dramatically different. There is almost no polarization. None of this is going on in any significant way in the African American population, whereas the white population is polarizing, going off into two extremes. So I would say this.
Sorry, Eric, just to be clear, so there's a consensus among African Americans regarding these cultural issues, or?
What I would say is if you compare liberal, African American liberals, African American conservatives, we'll see a lot less difference on issues. And Republicans and Democrats that are black. You won't see anything like the yawning chasms of opinion differentials. I think now, of course, you always have your small group of minority activists who are in the milieu, the university sector, and so on. But I think for the most part, this is not really affected, particularly African Americans, in anything like the same way it's affected the white population.
Yeah, I guess I could say that, just going back to the data, is that the baseline racial attitude of your average non-white Democrat, it was always higher than it was for their white counterparts, as you can see. I don't know if you're seeing it, but really what's happened lately is that white Democrats, whereas I guess non-whites have mostly stayed where they always have been, white Democrats have really rapidly closed the gap between them and other non-whites. And in some cases, what you find, and this is an interesting pattern, is what you find is that whites will shift and then non-white Democrats will follow them. So, for example, in the General Social Survey, they've been asking a question, should blacks work their way up without special favors? This is a question that's been asked since 1994. And what you find is that in 2016, there were more white liberals that disagreed with that statement, that disagreed that blacks should work their way up without special favors, than there were blacks who disagreed with that statement. And it was a pretty wide gulf. I think it was at least like a 15 percentage point gulf in 2016. And then in 2018, what you find is that blacks had caught up or had trended in the same direction as white Democrats and liberals. So, I made a joke about it on social media, and if people are telling you that you're oppressed and that you deserve special treatment, well, it's tough to argue with that, especially if you're disadvantaged. Everybody's saying I'm oppressed. White people are telling me I'm oppressed. How could I differ with that? And it's almost like they're following the leader.
I just want to quickly say, sorry, Musa, I just want to add to that if we look at measures around sexism and homosexuality and so on, clearly the African Americans are more conservative and have stayed considerably more conservative. So on racial indicators, and on that sexuality, homosexuality stuff, between black liberals and black conservatives, there isn't a huge difference, and there has not been this woke phenomenon at all. So race is the only place where the base level was already pretty highly liberal, but on other issues, whereas the white liberals have moved on all these dimensions.
Yeah, definitely.
I mean, one thing that I've pointed out a lot in my research is that, blacks and Hispanics and a lot of immigrant groups as well actually tend to be more socially conservative and religious on average than whites, and this has long been the case. And so one of the great ironies here is that if you create an environment that's hostile towards socially conservative or religious views, the people that's most likely to affect, that's going to affect more dramatically, are people who are black or Hispanic or immigrants or people from low socioeconomic backgrounds who tend to be more likely to hold those kinds of views than sort of white elites. But quickly to touch on Zach's point about the shift that you've seen about sort of these elite whites move first, and then eventually you see others starting to follow. I think part of the reason for this is because the demographic groups where these shifts are so pronounced, these, upper SES white liberals, are the people who who control most sites of cultural production in the United States. So when you look at the demographics of who's most likely to be a journalist or an editor, or who's most likely to be an academic or a teacher, even in primary schools, or who's most likely to work in entertainment industries, these are overwhelmingly upper SES whites who skew left are dramatically overrepresented in all of these fields. Similarly, even with social media, on Twitter and Instagram, for instance, if you look at the demographics of who uses Twitter and Instagram, it skews white, it skews affluent, it skews liberal dramatically. So a lot of these, so I think part of the reason why you're eventually seeing these shifts is because the attitudinal shifts that you've highlighted happen to have occurred, and the people who control, who dominate most of these other sites of sort of cultural production in America. And so I think that it is helping, and I think that actually might help explain too, for that matter, why you start seeing some of these shifts among Republicans in the same direction.
I do want to sort of maybe push back a little bit on I mean, I agree with largely what Musa was saying, but I do think that this is not really about class, and it's not necessarily about status. And the reason I say that is if you do, for example, if you try and model the Trump vote or attitudes to immigration or so on, income doesn't come in as a significant predictor. It's much more to do with your psychology. Do you see change as loss, difference as disorder, or do you see difference and change as interesting? And that is actually a 50% heritable disposition. Yes, it's correlated more with people who are highly educated. It's less correlated necessarily with pure wealth. And I think it would be a bit misleading, I think, and to see this as a class phenomenon or an elite phenomenon. It's really on the left-right. If we define left more broadly in terms of self-identification, and if we think about it in terms of a cultural radicalism rather than an economic redistribution, then I do think we can look at this wokeness as an ideology. Now, of course, you have your woke corporations and your bobos who are drawn to this. And this was something, by the way, that people noted in the 1970s just as well, this idea that the adversary culture appealed to the middle class. Why were these Black Panthers being portrayed in Vogue magazine and feted in bohemian circles? I mean, there was this attraction already. And I think that's a constant, but it's become more intense because of woke corporations. Although Samuel Huntington already in the late 90s was talking about DuPont and these other companies adopting these equality and diversity kinds of policy. I don't think it's as new as we're saying, but it is simply institutionalized to a greater extent. And the last point is that cultural radicalism, that kind of originally a bohemian adversary culture sensibility, takes very readily to corporations and wealthy people because it doesn't challenge their economic status. But it doesn't mean it's not left. It is still about adopting a kind of worldview that sees oppressor and oppressed groups. It's just those groups are now cultural categories, and the role of a high-minded person, Bayard Rustin talked about this in 1970. There are all these goal is really to bring this cultural leftism, which meshes very well with economic elitism. But I don't think we can say this is not leftism. I think it is.
One phenomenon, and this is perhaps an oversimplification, but when you're thinking about conflicts over distribution, the nature of them is that one can achieve half a loaf. One can have some kind of reconciliation. One can have some, middle ground position. Whereas in some conflicts over identity and recognition, it seems that it's harder to achieve some kind of middle ground. And I wonder if any of you have thoughts on this. Zach, if you'd care to weigh in, just when you're looking at conflicts that seem necessarily zero sum, the idea is that you're either seeing, just the idea that diversity is a kind of good in itself, then those who favor a more solidaristic perspective, those who value cultural cohesion, it seems hard to reconcile those perspectives. So I wonder if you have any thoughts about that. And I would welcome thoughts from Musa and Eric as well.
Are you asking if there's a conflict or an inherent tension between diversity and can you please repeat the question? I'm not sure if I gathered it.
If you think of the chief axis of political conflict as being around taxes and spending, then perhaps you could see a kind of back and forth. You might lose this battle, but whereas when there are conflicts over identity and recognition and the symbol we value, I kind of wonder if it's possible.
I think, especially as America's become, more diverse, people naturally in groups, members of groups naturally make social comparisons, between, how their group is doing, on a certain dimension versus how other groups. That's basic social identity theory. That's not necessarily, that doesn't necessarily manifest to the same degree across time. Obviously, the media could really make people or accentuate these gaps and disparities between people. And I think that the media has done that. There's a much greater focus in the past few years on disparities between groups. And this is really what I think, I don't think anybody's provided a concise definition of wokeness, but I will sum it up in a sentence that, wokeness is the belief that it relates to what a social scientist, Ben Weingart, calls cosmic egalitarianism, which is the belief really that all differences between groups can be attributed to discrimination and injustice. And I think that is a core tenet of woke ideology, is the notion that there's disparities between groups, and those disparities can be reduced to discrimination. And implicit in that is the notion that if we get rid of discrimination, there'd be equal outcomes. So this is how I think wokeness kind of really, it sets itself up for perpetual conflict, because unless you could believe that we can achieve equality of outcomes, we're going to be in these battles for quite some time. And there's not really much compromise. This is the thing. If the end goal is all groups should have the same outcomes, then really the battle isn't over until we reach that point. Sorry, Musa, you wanted to weigh in.
Sure. So one of the things that I find most striking about these shifts in recent years, I talked about this in a recent paper called Resistance as Sacrifice Towards an Aesthetic Anti-Racism, available in Sociological Forum. But the point is that the shifts that have occurred, the people with whom this woke ideology is most popular are in fact among elites. It's overwhelmingly elites, and I show this in a few ways. But what's striking about it is so they're taking these zero-sum positions, but they're taking these zero-sum positions about things that are, it's just talk about things that are purely symbolic, about things. So for instance, changing the name of a school from being named after a Confederate general to now being named after John Lewis. Sure, there's, I mean, like a lot of African Americans wouldn't object to that, but that's not the top of their racial priorities, right? Like that's not like what there's like, what am I most concerned about? What's the name of that school? So they're focused on these sort of gestures, these like symbolic gestures, and it's not actually about fundamentally changing the order. Most of the people who are putting out this woke ideology aren't actually making meaningful sacrifices. They're the people who are winning in the system. They're the people who are winning the most in the system, highly educated, upper SES people who are putting this out, and they're not actually sacrificing.
Socioeconomic status when you use the term SES, yep.
Mm-hmm. And they're not actually sacrificing a lot from themselves. What they're calling for is for other people, usually people who are benefiting a lot less from the system than they are, to give something up to help these other people. But in a lot of ways, precisely what this discourse allows them to do.
Sorry, Musa, just to be very, very clear about this, what you're saying is that when you're speaking of whites as a larger category and white privilege, this applies to elites and non-elites. And what you have are elite whites who are employing this discourse in a way that is affecting all people who are white, whether they're elite or non-elite. Is that roughly right?
So what you see a lot of times is you're seeing white elites deploying this kind of rhetoric primarily against non-white elites or other whites who are their political opponents. So it's white relatively well-off, highly educated liberals that are attacking mostly white, less educated, Republican-oriented people. So it's largely an intra-white conflict, and it's
in which non-whites are being invoked. They are being deployed as a tool for this kind of intra-white status competition.
Absolutely, and in a way that often is out of touch with, as Eric and as I have pointed out, except for the fact that there are elites of color, Black elites, Hispanic elites, who play the game because it benefits them, because they're elites too. And in fact, you had a great essay on this yourself in The Atlantic called "The Utility of White Bashing" that I would recommend.
Eric, you've written quite a bit about the idea that this, what you call this left modernist perspective, is really a deep and durable feature of the landscape, and that call it a more traditionalist conservative perspective is also a deep and durable feature of the landscape. And you've thought about ways to reconcile these perspectives, ways to almost have some kind of peace compact, some way that you can have a functioning society despite those deep disagreements. Tell us a bit more about how you think about reconciling those clashing perspectives.
Well, I think that ultimately we are going to have a desacralization take place, and I'm afraid that it has to be on the left, or the left modernist, this ideology, which we've called wokeness, which has sacralized race, gender, and sexuality. Those are ultimately going to have to be desacralized so that we can then start to make trade-offs. Because as long as something is a sacred value, as Scott Atran, who did work on this, it's like saying, well, I'll pay you a certain amount of money in order for the United States to give up some territory. Well, actually, that's kind of very important to people, and talking about money might actually make them matter, and so you really need this desacralization, I think, to take place. An example of that would be on immigration. If you sacralize immigration as about racism, and if you give an inch, the next thing you know, we're going to be in concentration camps, and it'll be Jim Crow, or whatever the fear narrative happens to be, then you're never going to have a compromise. What you actually need is, for example, people to say, okay, some people like change and difference, and other people prefer stability and continuity. We need to actually work out a speed of change that is somewhere in the middle. And similarly with diversity, some people like a ton of diversity and some people like a lot less of it. Those are actually both legitimate desires, but we need to actually have a middle ground. Problem is, if you've said there can be no such thing as too much diversity, too much change, then you can't have a conversation. So I think the first thing has to be to desacralize these things. And similarly with equality between groups, it is a goal we should aspire to, but it may be that you can't just sort of say it's an outrage that there's a racial gap in wealth, and we have to change it immediately by having quotas and having riots. Well, no, you've actually got to take a step back and say, it's one issue, and there are other issues, and we're going to trade off, and we're going to do the best we can. And in as intelligent, maybe we have to do nudges instead of quotas, but that kind of more rational trading needs to happen. And it's happened on the economy. We've managed to sort that out between socialism and total free market. We've got mixed capitalism. We need something on the cultural side that is a mix as well. We can't get there as long as these things are the subject of a religion, and so they're off limits to rational policy debate.
So, Eric, does that mean that there's room for some symbolic compromises? You get your statues, I get my statues, and we accept that there is room for both? Or tell us more about what you have in mind.
Well, yeah. So, for example, on statues, you would have a process where you might say, okay, let's look at the pluses and minuses. Let's look at the different way these statues are consumed by different people. Let's not go around trying to sensitize and get people worked up over something they're not already worked up about. And yeah, there may be some statues of awful people that may be taken down, but there's going to be a single standard that everyone kind of agrees on of pluses and minuses, and taking into account the fact that there were cultural and mental structures and limits that were there. Let's look at other societies in the world that had conquest and slavery and genocide, and with all of that context in mind, we'll then make a judgment. That, to me, would be a rational way of approaching it, rather than, oh my God, this person violated a sacred value back in 1820, they must come down. That sort of very, which again is the way sacred values operate, right? So if you violate that sacred value, if anybody can make a charge against anybody of being a racist or sexist or whatever, then it immediately triggers this mass response. So we have to somehow, I'm afraid that this will have to be an overcoming of the religious aspect of the secularization of these policy areas and transferring them into the realm of a rational compromise base. So immigration, fine, we find a middle way. Statues, again, we come up with some common accepted policies. That's the way forward, and we got to be able to talk about things like crime, family, etc. All of these things, which instead of people immediately pointing the finger and saying, sexism, you want to talk about the family, that means you're demonizing and seeing single mothers, etc. That kind of way of debating really makes it impossible to, I think, arrive at the kind of sane trade-offs that Jonathan Haidt, for example, talks about.
I want to remind everyone that you are very welcome to submit questions, so please do. We're very eager to take them. So tell, Musa, you've given some thought to the role of religion and the fact that when you're looking at religious belief, this can complicate how people look at these identity issues more broadly. Do you believe that secularization has shaped this this playing field to some degree?
That's I mean, so one of the tensions that you do see, yeah, okay. So I do think that secularism creates or helps elevate tensions that didn't exist in the same to the same level, and like when in an environment where things are less secular, because when you have to when you really aspire to treat all conceptions of the world as equal and to value to like fundamentally respect rather than just tolerate them, that does create a number of tensions. So for instance, in my work when I was at Heterodox Academy, one case that we saw, there were these Muslim and Jewish students who wanted to have swim hours, for instance, at a time to just have women, because it was against their religious beliefs to be swimming with men at the same time. So they petitioned the school to have swimming hours just for women. And the school granted that. But then there was, the question came up, well, what about trans women? Would they be able to swim in these women-only pool hours? And this creates a significant dilemma, because a lot of the Muslim students and the Jewish students who are more socially conservative, for them, a trans woman swimming with them wouldn't meet the would be a violation of the very rule that they're trying to. They wouldn't necessarily recognize a trans woman as a woman in the sense that as relevant for them following this religious edict, and so there was a real tension at the school of like, okay, well, you know, how can we on the one hand respect their religious beliefs, but then respect their religious beliefs in a way that doesn't invalidate the claims being made by these trans students? How do we respect their sort of gender and sexual identity at the same time? And there's not really a way to there's not like an answer to that question. There's not like a clear, obvious solution. What the school did is they ultimately did allow trans women to swim during the non-swimming hours because there wasn't really, legally speaking, I don't think, but then as a result of that decision, a lot of the people who the policy was originally intended for actually didn't end up using the swim hours because they in part then because some trans students then made it a point to swim during these hours to sort of underline their and so yeah, so this sort of appeal to neutrality, this attempt at neutrality, does create grounds where you'll have these kinds of tensions that are just not easy to reconcile. There just aren't, I don't think, clean answers to these. They're very deep problems.
We have a question from the audience, a question from Ben. If Eric's hope for a mixed economy settlement style settlement for culture proves out of reach, what do the next 2 decades look like? What's the future of the American culture wars? Now, Eric, I imagine you have some thoughts on this, but I am curious to hear from Zach. Zach, given the patterns that you've seen, that you've observed in the general social survey data and much else, do you have any rough thoughts as to how the ongoing culture wars might unfold in the next few years?
Yeah, I'm not very sanguine, at all, because I think there's an incentive among, political elites, among party elites, to actually appeal to woke sentiments. They, and this has been studied, really the discourse on Twitter and social media drives really, this one study found that it predicts what the party elites speak to, the types of sentiments that they, or the issues that they campaign on, and two, there is less of a risk now that the parties are so, sorted and polarized on race. You have, Republicans that are overwhelmingly white, and now you have the increasing, browning, you would call it, of the Democratic Party. It's less of a risk now, or at least, in apart from, maybe the certain elections where you have to appeal maybe more to the median voter, because there's less whites or middle class or working class whites in the ranks of Democrats, there's less of a risk, in appealing and pandering to people's identities and people's sense of victimhood. And I really think that we haven't seen the worst of it yet. I think it's going to get worse before it gets better. I don't think things will, regress back to where I think this is, at the very minimum, we've reached a new equilibrium point. This is, I think, and really, and I know Eric, considers this an important variable, but maybe he hasn't played to it, or put emphasis on it as much as I do. I really think technology has really, in general terms, we have the nationalization of politics. We have the nationalization of the local. And local incidents now become national news that's gripped the nation. Somebody can, make an off-color remark in a park in whatever town, and now it's all over the media. And now you have politicians weighing in as well. And politicians, really, it's well documented that activists have disproportionate influence over the parties. And I think social media has compounded this trend. And I really don't think there is an incentive to de-escalate, I guess. So I really think that, everybody's like, or is a civil war, on the horizon. I don't know if I would go that far, but I do think that, I guess I'm not very optimistic about, moving forward or coming towards some resolution, because I also think the Democratic Party is, they are gunning for as robust or as near permanent a majority as they could possibly attain. Talking about adding new states, talking about packing the court, and Republicans are going to be in a tough bind because they're going to have to really decide whether they want to compromise some of their core principles and economic matters for the sake of, attaining more of the non-white vote. And these are values that aren't, easily sacrificed. So it's going to be very interesting if, Republicans or especially white Trump voters, for instance, are backed into a corner where they feel like, they really don't have much influence anymore on outcomes. And in some extent, I understand the counter arguments to this, which is that, we're a tyranny of the minority right now. The political outcomes don't reflect the will of the majority. And obviously, the majority lives on the coast. It lives in California. They live in the big cities. And I really don't see a, reconciliation going forward. And that concerns me. So I really, to answer a very, sum it up in one sentence, I predict further conflict. We're headed in a direction of further conflict. There might be some ebbs and flows along the way, but I think more or less that, this type of, at least for the foreseeable future, this is where we are, and this is where we're going to continually or increasingly head.
Eric, do you have a more optimistic interpretation?
I really don't, I'm afraid. I think really until wokeness, what I call left modernism, has hit a wall and sort of desacralizes itself. You almost need a 1989 moment, as was the case for communism, or 1945 for fascism, or perhaps the Wall Street crash for unbridled capitalism, but some kind of cataclysm or some kind of failure that makes it clear that this ideology, the utopia, that dream, that chiliastic hope of the religion cannot be fulfilled. And people lose belief in the religious, the millenarian vision. Because without that, and with constant advance through the elite institutions, the universities, sections of the media, corporations, etc., taking them over from the ground up, controlling and tightening the grip of this culture, also in the school system and the media and so on. What that's going to mean is that a whole set of issues downstream are not going to be solved, one of which might be immigration. So it might be the case, it may not be defund the police or abolish the border, but it might be close to that. What that's going to do is increase the rate of change and diversification of the population. So it might increase the rate of crime. A lot of these downstream effects will then be felt by the kinds of voters who voted for Trump, who will feel increasingly alienated. Now, as Zach said, they may not be able to win the presidency anymore, or even if the Republicans do get in, they'll have to get in on a very watered down ticket, something like you see in my home country of Canada, where the Conservative Party has to effectively water its message very heavily on cultural issues in order to get elected. But then that leaves a very disaffected group. In Europe, that would tend to vote for the populist right, a breakaway party, for example. And I think that could be, in the United States case, my guess is it would take the form of the Democrats usually winning the presidency and the Republicans winning governor's mansions and the Senate will become kind of the stronghold of this group of people who are otherwise disenfranchised. So they're going to express, in my view, what will be a very anti-federal government, which of course chimes well with a lot of existing sentiment in this group. And I think this is only going to deepen the polarization. I don't go for the Civil War theory. I think we may see, if Trump loses, which no one's talked enough about what happens if, as it looks likely, he's going to lose, what is the reaction to that going to be on the conservative, particularly with his base? And I think that that's an important thing to talk about, because if you start to get that sense of disenfranchisement, which we've seen in other countries, Northern Ireland, the Catholics lost every election for 50 years. Well, what did that lead to? Not something good. So I think there has to be some way of bringing these two solitudes, to use the Canadian language, together.
Musa, do you believe that there's room for decentralization, for federalism, to create some kind of harmony, to allow different communities to establish their own compromises so that we can retreat from some larger nationalized cultural struggle?
I mean, so one big problem or error that creates a lot of these tensions is the idea that there has to be one answer that applies for everyone everywhere in America. And as I said, a lot of these tensions are very complicated and they're not easily resolved. And different communities have different needs. They're composed of different people with different histories. And so the idea that all communities have to come to the same answer on all of these questions is part of what creates this sort of amplified zero-sum struggle. So I think more focus on local communities, on having on different on some version of federalism, I think would go a long way to helping. One of my favorite books that I've read recently was The Liberal Archipelago, which was also making a case for something for sort of more decentralized. How likely is it that we'll see that happen? Less optimistic, in part because, as Zach said, social media is a big thing that sort of elevates everything, that nationalizes the local, and at the same time, actually, a lot of local newspapers have been closing. They've been eaten up by big conglomerates over and over again, and so a lot of the sort of institutions of civic culture that operate at the local level have been being eroded or taken over by these sort of national. And that's unfortunate. And that I think if we really want to help sort of take down the temperature, focusing on federalism, on localism, on letting different people have different answers to these questions, I think would be a great way to do it. I just don't know.
Thanks, Musa. That's very helpful. We have a question from Miguel. Do the panelists have thoughts about the lack of ideological diversity in the academy? Eric, I know you've done some work on this recently, so
I'm
eager to hear your thoughts.
I would also headline, we have, there's going to be a report on academic freedom in Britain, which will be out shortly, and I can't say when that's going to be out, but just watch your news feeds. But one of the things you see in the UK, where I'm based, is that if you take professionals with advanced degrees, masters and PhDs, doesn't matter what sector they're in, they're very left, and they're very unlikely to have voted, for example, to leave the European Union. The equivalent would be voting for Trump. The difference between academics, who almost all have PhDs, and PhDs in these other professional sectors is not that large. It's not great. So most of the explanation for why academia is so left-wing, I think, is largely due to education level and people selecting in on that basis. Now, having said that, there are a number of studies showing quite extensive political discrimination. And this is, of course, a problem in society, and particularly amongst the more highly educated population tends to be more likely to politically discriminate. A new Cato study was just out, showed something like 42% of Democrats say that a business executive who donated to the Republicans should be fired. I think it was 28% the other way around. So there's very strong political discrimination. Academia is like the rest of society, and you have substantial political discrimination. I don't think that's shaped. I think if conservatives in the academy were open about their views, especially early in their career, I think whatever it is, the 6-to-1 ratio or 5-to-1 in the social sciences would be even greater. But I think they know to keep their mouths shut, and in a way that's a problem for academic freedom. So I think the problem could be even worse. But the mix that we see, I think, is largely to do with education levels, which are increasingly correlated with voting.
So real quick, as you may know, for a few years I was the communications director for an organization called Heterodox Academy, which is focused on enhancing viewpoint diversity within institutions of higher learning, which includes ideological diversity. We spend a lot of time and energy on ideological diversity as well. Yeah, one thing that I'll flag that's interesting to build on Eric's point is that one of the most striking things is that even the conservatives and libertarians, the moderates that you see in the academy, as Eric said, a lot of them are less likely. They tend to try to work on non-controversial issues and to kind of keep their political views to themselves so that they don't generate hostility and weirdness in their department. But then secondly, the kinds of conservatives and Republicans that you see within higher education, and actually to a lesser extent within elite institutions more general, to include like the conservatives in the New York Times or whatever, they tend not to be kind of like hard right people. They tend to be sort of moderate conservatives. There's like very few academics, for instance, or even New York Times columnists or whatever, who are like on the board Trump supporters, for instance. There's some who held their nose and voted for Trump, or who will, right? With some exceptions, Adrian Vermeule, Amy Wax, but even those people, Patrick Deneen, have been kind of rendered pariahs within their institutions for sort of crossing that line. And so I guess the point is that the ideological diversity problem is actually maybe more significant, it's greater than it appears to be, not only because there's not a lot of conservatives, but even the conservatives that exist in the academy tend to sort of be center-right. So you don't see there's a whole bunch of political views in America that are not represented really at all within academia, including a whole bunch of different views. It's not only views on the right, and it's not only religious views, but those are some of the most significantly underrepresented ones.
We've only scratched the surface. I have to say, the work of Eric, Zach, and Musa is incredibly rich. They cover an incredibly wide range of subjects. I'm so grateful to all of you for joining us today. And I'm sure that all of you would profit from reading with their work, engaging with their work. Zach is working on his dissertation right now, has a number of papers in the hopper. Musa has a number of articles that he's published recently on these and other subjects. Eric has a slew of books, Whiteshift being only the most recent, and a number of reports that are coming out soon.
I pulled it off the shelf just for special.
Excellent. Perfect.
You must buy 10 copies.
Thank you to everyone watching us for your time and your many thoughtful questions. If you'd like to hear more conversations like today's, or are interested in supporting our mission, I'd encourage you to subscribe to the Manhattan Institute's newsletters or consider making a donation. There are links for doing so in the comments window on your screen. Thank you, everyone. This was great. Hope to see you all again soon.
Great talking to you guys.